Hi and welcome to this tutorial for the Riggies Vest. Before I get stuck into step-by-step aspects of making the vest, I just wanted to give a little introduction and tell you a little bit more about it. So this vest is a kind of an oversized vest with positive ease. It is knit, or my sample at least is knit in Jamiesons of Shetland DK yarn, which is 100% Shetland wool, and it's a woolen spun yarn. So it makes a very light, kind of lofty garment, very breathable, but warm and cozy. I would recommend that you use a similar type of yarn, so a woolen spun yarn if possible, if you're looking for a similar result to the sample you're seeing here. I also wanted to let newer knitters know that I do think this vest pattern is accessible. I am providing this video tutorial with a lot of breakdown of the different steps, so hopefully that will help take you through it. The only thing I would say is that it's not a very typical construction for a vest. It's made in 4 pieces and seamed together, but it is all garter stitch, so nothing is too difficult. When thinking about picking a size, I would recommend taking a good look at the schematic for the measurements and, check those out on your own body, make sure that the length is going to be good for you, etc. As I mentioned, it is intended to be worn with positive ease. So this is the size 2 that I have on, which is a 40-inch. And that gives me about 3 inches of positive ease. It essentially is making a square or slight rectangular shape. The proportions are going to change a little bit as it goes up in sizes. So when you get up towards the larger sizes, the fit is going to be a little different than it appears in the lower sizes, and that is due to the construction. There are some restraints there in terms of what can be done with the width and the short rows and everything that are worked. I do cover ways to make modifications in this video. So you'll see, first of all, I will break down the construction for you. We're showing you kind of the schematic and talking about the different parts, then explaining where you could make modifications. And then I will be taking you through a step-by-step tutorial. So I hope this is helpful and that you enjoy making a Riggies vest. So here I am going to give you an overview of the Riggies vest construction using essentially what is the schematic for the pattern. I will show in an actual video, step-by-step instructions on how to do certain techniques and things like that. But this is just an overview of the general construction. So you can see with this schematic that we have a right segment and a left segment. The back and the front of the Riggies vest are identical. So you will work 2 right segments and 2 left segments, and then they will be joined together to make a back and a front. However, each segment is worked separately. So each one begins with the cast on here, and then the direction of the knitting is, as these arrows show you, this direction for the right segment, this direction for the left segment. And initially you are working back and forth in garter stitch rows, and this is happening at the same time as working the neck area up here. At the top here, these neck stitches, the last stitch of the row gets slipped to create a nice edge for the neck there. Once you have finished that section, you will be instructed to bind off a certain number of stitches to make that funnel neck shape. And then you are working short rows to shape the shoulder here. So you will work a right segment times 2, a left segment times 2, and then they will get joined together. So you take one of each segment and work a 3-needle bind off down here to join them together. So you'll do that for each pair so that you have a back and a front. Then you will join the shoulder stitches also with a 3-needle bind off. Then next you will join a short section of both sides to the back and the front. They'll get joined together, leaving some live stitches for your armhole area here. Then next you pick up along the bottom edge to work the hem, which will be worked in this direction down. Then the final thing you'll do is come back to these live armhole stitches here, and you will work an I-cord bind off for those stitches. So I also wanted to describe where you could make some modifications to the vest. It's fairly adaptable, so if you are kind of in between sizes, I believe the size gap is about 5 inches or so between each one. So if you need something a little different, the areas that you could make adjustments to would be to work more or less rows in your first section here, where the neck is also being worked, and also to work more or less rows in the shoulder shaping area here. Obviously, because of the direction that we are knitting, your row gauge is what really matters if you are trying to adjust the overall width of the vest. And if you are adjusting your rows in the neck area here, then you just need to bear in mind that that will affect the final neck circumference, because each segment is a quarter of the neck circumference. So if you add in more rows, it's going to be a bit wider, less rows is going to be a bit narrower. I will say there is quite a bit of flexibility with the neck area because it's in garter stitch, and even just adding or taking away, 1 or 2 rows is not going to make a huge difference there, but it can affect the overall width of the finished vest. And then if you are adjusting the number of rows worked in the shoulder area, working more or less short rows here, you just need to bear in mind that that is going to affect where that shoulder lands on your body. Obviously, if you work more rows, it's going to come further down. It's kind of often over the shoulder with its oversized fit anyway. But those are 2 areas where you can adjust for the width of the vest. And then if you want to add length to this vest, it is a relatively cropped style. So that is actually quite easy to do. You would just cast on more stitches for each segment. Obviously the same number for each segment so that they all match, but you would just add in more stitches there. Obviously that will use up more yarn, so you just have to bear that in mind. Then you can also adjust a little bit for length by working more rows of the hem too. And then finally, you can also adjust the armhole depth. As written in the pattern, all sizes have the same armhole opening and same number of stitches that are left for the side body here before the hem is worked. So if you wanted that to be a little bigger or smaller, then you would just adjust the number of stitches that you were allocating to the armhole area here. Obviously, if you had cast on more stitches at the start, then you would have a different number of stitches to play with here. So that might make it, a little bit easier to adjust the armhole there.
But again, even just adjusting by a few stitches will likely be enough if you need it to be a little snugger or a little looser. And those are really generally the main modifications that can be made with the Riggies Vest. So, as mentioned in the overview of the construction for the Riggies Vest, you are working 4 separate segments, 2 right segments and 2 left segments. I have the start of a left segment here. So I have cast on the number of stitches for the size that I am making, and I have used a long tail cast on. Ideally, that's the type of cast on you should use here. With the long tail cast on, the first row worked after the cast on is going to be a wrong side row. Depending on whether you're working a right segment or a left segment, you will be slipping a stitch at the end of either a wrong side row or a right side row during the first section of the segment. For the left segment, that happens at the end of this first wrong side row. We start slipping a stitch at that end, and that's the edge where the neck will be, the top part of the funnel neck. So by slipping that stitch, we're getting a nice finished edge to that section. So I will go ahead and work up to there and show you slipping that final stitch. So here I am at the last stitch of the row on a wrong side because I'm working a left segment, and I want to slip the last stitch of the row. So I bring my yarn forward first before I do that, and this will apply whether you're working on a right or a wrong side for this slip stitch. Bring the yarn forward first, slip the stitch purlwise, and then turn your work ready to begin the next row, which in my case is a right side row. So with all of the segments, it is a good idea to mark the right side of your knitting. So the first time that you're working this right side row, either at the end of it, if that's easier to put a removable marker into, you can mark the right side then. You can also just weave in a bit of scrap yarn into the stitches to mark the right side. But because this is in garter stitch, that is a really good idea so that you can identify your right side and wrong side when it comes time to join these pieces together. So now, whether you're working a right or left segment, you will be working in garter stitch and slipping the last stitch of the row either on a right side or a wrong side row according to the pattern and where you are. And we do that for the stated number of rows, and that gives us our first section, which will include our neck stitches, and we'll have this slip stitch along the top part where the neck edge is, and then we're going to bind off our neck stitches.
Okay, so I have finished the first set of garter rows where I've been slipping the stitch up at the top neck edge, so you can see what that looks like. And just as a reminder, I'm working on a left segment here, so I've worked the required number of rows for that first part, and then I'm going to be binding off some stitches at the beginning of this next row for creating that funnel neck shape on this piece. I did just want to also talk about counting garter stitch rows. In the pattern, I have included how many garter stitch ridges you should have when you're at this stage of then binding off for the neck. So literally the garter ridge is the bump part of the garter stitch here. If you look closely at garter stitch, you see the bump, and then you see in between the knit rows, or the V stitches. So you get a bump, and then a V, bump, V, and so on. So a quick way to count the garter stitch rows for this project, you do need to have the right side facing. So again, this is why it's a good idea to mark the right side of the knitting at the start. but you'll be counting each of these garter ridges to check that you have the right amount. Of course, you can also use a row counter if you prefer and keep track of your rows that way. And also, just as a reminder, this would be one of the areas that if you needed to make an adjustment for a different width in the overall vest, this is where you would be either doing less rows potentially or more rows. But again, it's going to affect your overall neck circumference if you change the number of rows there. So in the case of the left segment, you will have the right side facing you when you do the bind off for the neck. It'll be the opposite on the right segment. So you bind off 10 stitches to make that funnel neck for the vest. In the pattern, it does give you the option of casting on less stitches if you don't want the neck to come up as high, and then in which case you would be casting off less stitches at this point. And then the next thing we'll be starting is the wrap and turn short row shaping for the neck section. So that will be shaping the shoulders. So we will go over that part next. So I am about to do my first wrap and turn on the first wrong side row after binding off my neck stitches. The wrap and turns are worked the same way, regardless of whether you're working them on a wrong side row or a right side row, because that will be opposite depending on which segment you're working on, whether it's a left or a right segment. So initially, the instructions will tell you to work up to 2 stitches before the end of the row, and then you'll slip the next stitch on the left hand needle purlwise over to the right hand needle, take your yarn around the needle, bring it to the front of the work. Then you're going to slip that stitch back, making sure you're not twisting it so it stays in the same position. Then you're going to turn the work, and this stitch here has been wrapped, here we go, by the working yarn. So it's coming around the base of that stitch. You are going to place a marker at this point on the right hand needle after you turn, and that's going to help you identify that wrap stitch when we come to work the next wrap and turn. It's a little hard to see the wrap and turn in garter stitch. You also won't be picking up the wraps at all. They will just stay wrapped around the stitch. Then when you're working your second wrap and turn short row, you'll be instructed to knit up to 1 stitch before the marker, and you will slip that stitch again purlwise. You're going to remove the marker temporarily. You'll wrap the base of that stitch the same way, so bring yarn forward, slip the stitch back to the left hand needle, that's the stitch wrapped, and then this is the turning part, and you will place the marker back on again, and then knit to the end of the row on this side. So you'll just keep repeating that for however many repeats your size tells you to in the pattern, and that is going to be shaping essentially the sort of shoulder area. So it's going to create a slope on the shoulder. And again, we are not picking up those wraps. And if you want to add additional width to the vest, this is the sort of second area that you can amend the width. So you could do more or you could do less short rows too if you're looking to make it a bit narrower. And then when you have finished that short row section, this is what the slope is going to look like. And these stitches for the shoulder will get put on a separate piece of scrap yarn or a stitch holder or cable, whatever you have handy. And then the remainder of the stitches that weren't part of the short rows, they are put on a separate piece of scrap yarn for the side body. So they'll become partly armhole stitches and partly side body stitches. And then when you have finished 2 right segments and 2 left segments, you'll be pairing a right and a left up together to make a back or a front. Again, this is reversible, so it doesn't really matter what you're calling it, but you want one right segment, one left segment, and you are making sure, again, that the right sides are facing. So if you put a marker on your right side, you should be able to see that right now. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to pick up stitches along each of these pieces separately and then join them together with a 3 needle bind off. So first of all, we'll look at picking up the stitches. So we're now going to pick up stitches along this cast on edge. Doesn't really matter if you start with the left segment or the right segment here, but you do have to have the right side facing you. And just something to point out, I'm going to use a contrast color yarn to work this 3 needle bind off. So that means that I'm going to have a sort of pop of color down the center, front and back of the vest. If you obviously want to do it just in the same color yarn, then that's what you would be using. But this is an opportunity to throw in a little bit of color if you feel like it. So here is the cast on edge that we want to pick up from. So you want to find the very first cast on stitch, so you can see kind of the V shapes there of the cast on edge. I like to aim for the hole that is essentially beneath each of those. So I'm going underneath the first stitch and wrapping the yarn to catch, and then bringing that up and through as the first stitch. Then I'm going to go into the next hole and pick up that stitch. So you are essentially doing a 1-for-1 pickup along your cast on edge. But one thing I do want to point out is in the pattern, I tell you to aim for 1 stitch less than the number of stitches you cast on, because with the long tail cast on, with other cast ons too, there's often a sort of half stitch that is hard to find. So it's easier, I think, to just aim for 1 stitch less during your pickup. If you have all of the cast on stitches, then go for it, that's fine. The main thing that you need to make sure of, though, is that you pick up the same number of stitches on both the right and the left segment, because you need the same number to work the 3 needle bind off. Once you have your 2 sets of stitches picked up on both of the cast on edges of the right segment and the left segment, when you've worked the second pickup, you'll be instructed in the pattern to just leave the working yarn attached, and you'll use that to work the 3 needle bind off. So you also are instructed to hold the wrong sides of the 2 segments together as you work this bind off. So these are my right sides, inside here my wrong sides, so I'm holding those together as I work the 3 needle bind off. Typically you would use a 3rd needle to work the 3 needle bind off. I just have a really long cable here, so I'm just choosing to use the other end of the cable and I am using my US 8 or main needle, main fabric needle for the actual bind off part. We'll get in a bit closer here. Okay, So there are a few different ways to work 3-needle bind off. So you may have a preferred method. What we're going to be doing is knitting into the first stitch on the front needle and the first stitch on the back needle, knitting them together as one. We'll do that again for the second, and then we'll start to bind off. Some 3-needle bind off instructions have you join all of the stitches for one row, but not actually bind off until the second row. So just want to point that out. I think that some of the testers did it where they did do the bind off on the second row, but my preference is for doing it as I join the stitches. So I'll go into the first stitch on the front needle, first stitch on the back needle, wrap the yarn, bring it through both of those, take them both off. Then I'm going to do the same for the next pair. And I'm now going to start binding off my stitches. So I'm lifting this one to the right over to bind off one stitch. Then I will join another pair and then bind off. So I'll basically be doing that all the way down across all of the stitches. And as you go, you can just kind of check on your tension to make sure it's not, too tight or too loose. I generally try to keep a little bit of a looser tension during this bind off. So here is one right segment and one left segment joined together with a 3-needle bind off, and you will just repeat that for the other pair, and then we will go ahead and do a 3-needle bind off for the shoulder areas. Okay, so now we are going to get ready to join one set of shoulder stitches. You will have the wrong sides of the front and the back facing each other for this. And again, that's going to give us an exposed kind of seam along the 3-needle bind off at the shoulder. So I have already put my shoulder stitches onto my 2 sets of needles. You are told to place them onto US 8, and then the bind off is going to be with the US 9. The stitches along the shoulder here are looser because of the wrap and turn. So you also want to be careful not to bind off too tightly along this as you're working the 3-needle bind off, but you'll work it the same way you did for joining the left and right segments. We will knit 2 stitches, one from each needle together, and we'll be binding off as we go. And it will create a slightly different looking seam along this section because of the looser stitches here. So you'll be going through the first stitch on the front needle and the first stitch on the back needle. And I'm just joining in the yarn here, and you want to come back through both of those stitches, take them off, join the next one or the next pair, and now that we have the 2 stitches on this side, we will start to bind off. And just again check as you work the bind off to make sure that it isn't coming out too tightly. So shoulder stitches are now joined, and as you can see, you do have these looser looking stitches either side and this exposed seam, but as I said, that is deliberate. It's intentional, so don't worry that you've done something wrong. Some of the testers for this pattern, because they use different yarn as well, chose to knit across their shoulder stitches first before doing the 3-needle bind off to get a join that they preferred the look of. So you could do that. The other thing I wanted to mention here is I didn't use a contrast color for this section. That's just a personal choice. If you were using the same contrast yarn that you had used perhaps here on the center join, then I would suggest picking up on either side of these neck stitches as well, so that you can get a continuous line of the same color. Otherwise, if you're doing it in the same color as the main fabric, then you can just go ahead and just seam the shoulder stitches or do the 3-needle bind off, sorry. Then you'll be seaming the bound off edges of the neck here. So it's just pretty short amount of seaming, and we'll look at that too. But go ahead and join the second set of shoulder stitches first. So for seaming this short neck section, if you happen to have a long enough tail at the top of your 3-needle bind off area, then you could use that to seam up there. Otherwise, you'll just join in a new piece of yarn. And so we are looking just at these stitches along the bound off edge here. What I like to do for seaming two bound off edges together is I'm going to come underneath the V here on this side, pull my yarn through, then I'm going to find the first V on this side, pull my yarn through, oops, come back over to this side, get the next pair of legs, pull through, and so on, just going back and forth. And this is the seamed up neck area here. And so again, you'll just repeat that the other side. And then we will be dealing with the armhole area, or the side seams essentially that create the armhole section and the lower join of this side body. So now we are dealing with the remaining stitches that have been placed on hold. So we had the shoulder stitches, we've joined them. This is technically the side body, and a number of the stitches will be left for working the armhole, and you'll be instructed to place the lower set of stitches, which is going to be 16 stitches from a front and a back. Place those onto needles and then work another 3-needle bind off just over this short section here. So you'll work that exactly the same way as the other 3-needle bind offs. And then we pick up the remaining stitches to work the armhole area. The first thing you will do for the armhole is to place these live stitches onto the US 8 16-inch circular needle. You might manage to get away with it with a 20-inch as well, or if you want to do a longer cable and work magic loop, that will work as well. But initially, just start by placing the live stitches onto the needle first. Once you have those live stitches placed onto the needle, then you are going to knit across these stitches, and we're actually going to be picking up a stitch at the top shoulder join here. We'll also pick up a stitch at the bottom center when we get back around to that. So go ahead and knit up to the shoulder first. So when you get up to the shoulder join here, you just want to find something close to the edge here to pick up and make a stitch out of.
You don't want to pick up in this loose stitch part because that won't look as neat. So just pick up something right in the center of where the 3 needle bind off stitches are, and then start to knit down across the second side. And obviously, you know, you can come back and use some of your tails here to neaten up this join afterwards. And when you get back down to the center underarm where you have the 3 needle wind off for the side seam there, you'll just do the same again. Pick up something kind of in the center of the 3 needle bind off at the top and pick that up. Now we are going to work an I-cord bind off around all of the armhole stitches. But first of all, we need to create 3 extra stitches. So we're going to work a cable cast on for that. So I'm going to go in between the first and the second stitch on the left hand needle here. I'm going to wrap the yarn, pull it through, place that stitch over onto the left hand needle, and you need to kind of keep things relatively loose when you work the cable cast on, but we're only doing it for 3 stitches, so you just kind of repeat each time to get that stitch going in between the first and the second stitch on the needle and pulling that through. So now we have our extra 3 stitches and we'll begin to work the I-cord bind off. So to work the bind off, what you'll be repeating around these armhole stitches is you'll knit 2 stitches, and then you'll work a slip, slip, knit of the next 2 stitches. Then those 3 stitches here on the right hand needle will be slipped back over to the left hand needle, and you will repeat that. So knit 2, slip, slip, knit. So you're binding off as you work the I-cord around the armhole, and again, just check your tension as you go. You definitely need this to be a flexible I-cord for the armhole area. If you know you're a tight knitter, you could always just go up in needle size to work the bind off as well. And you can see that starting to form here. So you'll do that all the way around the armhole, and then we will have 3 stitches left at the end, and you're just going to pull the yarn through those final 3 stitches, and the 2 ends of the I-cord will just get seamed together as part of the weaving in your ends. And then the next thing we'll be doing after that is picking up stitches along the bottom edge of the vest to work the hem. So once you've seamed all your shoulders and done the armholes, etc., then the last thing you'll be doing is picking up along the bottom edge of the vest. So we're picking up against the rows of the garter stitch here, and then we'll be working the hem down from these picked up stitches. So in the pattern, you'll be instructed to pick up at a rate out of 2 out of 3 rows. Okay, so if we look at it this way, these are our rows. With garter stitch, you have a bump at the outside edge here. That's going to be 1 row. Then you also kind of have a space in between the garter ridges that is also a row, kind of where your V stitches are. So each of those counts as 1 row. garter ridge is 1 row, V is 1 row, etc. So 2 out of 3 rows when you're picking up will be going into a bump first. And let me just join my yarn in here. And then you're going to pick up in the V. I like to make sure that I have 2 legs underneath when I'm picking up stitches from an edge, just to make it stronger, as opposed to just grabbing 1 leg there. I will go under 2 at the edge. So that is my 2 rows picked up. Now I want to miss the next bump and go into the next V section. So that means I do a V, then I do a bump. I'm going to skip the next V, so it'll be into the bump, into the V, and so on. So you're skipping every 3rd row. So it'll alternate like that. It'll be V, bump, skip, bump, V, skip, etc. all the way around. And that should give you a good number of stitches for working the hem. You will need a repeat of 4 stitches to work the ribbing. So I prefer to pick up the stitches based on the rate that's been given, and if I need to decrease down to get to a multiple of 4, then I will just work that into my first round worked. It's also a good idea to, make sure that you pick up a stitch in any section where there is a gap between the pieces. So the 3 needle joins on the front and the back, and also the ones at the side seam, you're probably going to want to grab another stitch in there. And then once you've picked up all your stitches and you know what your stitch count is, you'll place a marker for working in the round, and you'll just be working the garter rib on the hem to the required number of rows or to your desired length.